Hello again, listeners. Welcome to the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I'm Alex Sargent.
And I'm Chris Holliday.
Now, Chris, we're sort of here and we're sort of not. This is the first episode of a number of re-releases from our back catalogue. Chris and I are off on our summer holidays right now, and busy recording a few more episodes for the new year, I suspect, is what we're actually doing. But so that you don't feel abandoned in this kind of absence of new content, we thought it'd be a nice opportunity to go back and revisit some of the highlights from our burgeoning archive of podcasts and go over some old favourites.
Yes, the archive, the vault, whatever it is you want to call it. This is, I guess, the first in perhaps half a dozen or so kind of, revisiting episodes. So this episode that we're going to kind of briefly introduce, I guess, or reintroduce, was episode 20, so a relatively early one, with Professor Richard Dyer. And it was on Peppa Pig.
Yes, this is one of those episodes. So we do some sort of backstage
We talk about this
gossip.
a lot, this one, yeah.
Well, we can do some backstage gossip because I don't think we talk about that in the episode. Is that when we were starting the podcast, we were trying to get together some sort of big name guests, and we were both lucky enough to know Richard and knew he was nice enough that he might actually say yes if we ask him on. And I can remember an email exchange with him whereby we were saying what he wanted to come on and talk about. And I think we got a very lovely email with all these different things. We were going to talk about the Hitchcock dream sequences.
Vertigo,
and then like at the end of one email for like a sentence, said, "Oh, and by the way, I also really like Peppa Pig, but does that count?"
Yes.
And at which point we hastily kind of cobbled this together. So this was recorded in Richard's front room.
Yes, it was Richard's home. Yeah, he kindly invited us in for tea and to talk about.
I was amazed by how much thought and work he put into it. He's Richard Dyer. Richard Dyer was doing us a favour by just letting us sit there and record a podcast around him. And he, as you're about to hear, he has some really interesting thoughts on the show, some really interesting context to think about, and he was sitting there with pages of notes. I think we only even... One day we'll have to go and see what else was written on that piece of paper. Yeah. But I loved this episode, and I think everyone's going to love revisiting it if they've not heard it before.
Yeah, and the fact that we recorded it in Richard's home as well kind of gives it that. I think we wanted.
You'll hear him squeaking on a table when he puts his elbow on it. I wasn't about to tell him not to.
No, well, there's something about the podcast. Part of as we've talked about, kind of making or demystifying, I guess, academic thinking and scholarship in particular kinds of ways. So it was nice to discuss. A program. And something that I guess a lot of listeners will be familiar with, but kind of bring it into alignment then and there live and kind of do some academic thinking, sitting around a table where we take, Peppa Pig and think through that, think through the aesthetics of Peppa Pig through the work of Henri Matisse.
Absolutely. And that's literally about to happen in about half an hour's time. So we will sit back, I'm about to say relax and enjoy it with you. We're off. We're not going to listen to it, but you can, and I really recommend you do. We'll see you next time.
I'm Peppa Pig. This is my little brother George. This is Mummy Pig. And this is Daddy Pig. Peppa Pig.
Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I'm, of course, Alex Sargent.
And I am, of course, Chris Holliday.
This week, it is my absolute pleasure to invite and welcome, I should say, Richard Dyer to the podcast, who is going to talk to us about Peppa Pig. And now that I've said that sentence out loud, I can retire from academia because my work is done. Richard, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining us.
It's great.
It's funny because I'm obviously thinking about ways to introduce you and kind of the subject areas that you've studied. From here on in, one of the most recent things you will also be known for is now talking about Peppa Pig on a podcast. For listeners who are perhaps unfamiliar with Richard's work, he's written a lot on stars and stardom, entertainment, and more recently he has delved into kind of questions of music and the relationship between music, film, and feeling, to quote the title of one of his books on Nina Rota, and a book as well on In the Space of a Song, the uses of song in film.
Yes, so Richard, we were very keen to get you on the podcast, and to be honest, we were so keen, listeners, that we basically gave you a free invitation.
We did.
And you've picked Peppa Pig. So...
Well, no, but I didn't. Yeah, I was very interested. It was just a little sentence at the end.
Well, let's
when I said something like, "Well, of course I like Peppa Pig." I think I said, "Well, why don't we discuss Vertigo?"
Yes,
it's funny, Richard, you mentioned that. We have the email right here.
So we are invited Richard and to talk about either something maybe connected to his work, the role of animation. The first 3 paragraphs are very much about vertigo, classical cinema, the insertion of animation into classical cinema, which is interesting, I think, and sort of dream sequences. And then there's one line, and it's this is the line. I am a devotee of Peppa Pig and Shaun the Sheep, but of course these are not fantasies. And you had us at that.
Yes.
So what we normally do when we have guests on is ask kind of where they're coming from in terms of why Peppa Pig. So why I am a devotee of Peppa Pig and Shaun the Sheep, but of course these are not fantasies. Why
expand
Peppa
and discuss.
discuss, yes.
Well, perhaps I should just begin by saying I never watched children's television. I barely watched children's things, even when I was a child. We didn't have television until I was 10. But even then, I did watch... My favourite programme as a child was a programme called Billy Bean and His Funny Machine, which seems to be a forgotten animation. But anyway, I don't know if there are any copies left. But I didn't watch much television, and I read Noddy, but I've never been into children's things, even as a child. I don't have children. I never wanted to have children. I get on fine with children, but I don't have much to do with them anyway. But my partner Giorgio loves children's things. Has always loved children's things, and he loves cartoons. And he often watches. He loves Sesame Street. He loves Shaun the Sheep, and he loved Peppa Pig. Mm-hmm. And he said, "Oh, you should really watch it." And I thought, ridiculous.
Yes,
but in fact, I've sort of discovered the child in myself.
Oh, wonderful. I mean, it is
yes.
interesting. I can see why, certainly my relatives, my nieces and nephews, why they are attracted to it. I think it's very appealing.
Yes.
It's very well structured if the plots themselves aren't particularly dramatic.
Yes.
But if you kind of take a cross-section of episodes, it does some really interesting stuff.
Yeah.
And when I mentioned to other members of my family who are parents, they were recommending episodes to me some episodes are really clever, or they're very self-conscious and reflexive. And so actually there's a lot within the programme. So what is it for you?
There's quite a lot on the internet, as you... I just had a quick trawl of being, we should ban our children from watching it. So it's interesting, there is that other side of it. Mm-hmm. Well... do you want me to talk about the fantasy thing first? Because it's not the only thing I like about it. But when I was thinking about doing this, I was thinking, well, what is fantasy? I'm sure you spent a lot of time. Because I thought, at one level, it obviously is fantasy because pigs don't talk.
Yes.
And the pigs that don't sort of go to school with rabbits and elephants and everything. So it's in a way, it obviously isn't. Obviously, is fantasy if one means by that something which is. We can sort of agree is ontologically not real. I don't know if that's a. But then I thought, but at a second level, because I was also thinking what you were talking about, what you talk about the primary and secondary, and I was thinking, where would you fit this into primary and secondary worlds of and so on? Because at another level, it's completely banal. I mean, in terms of what happens once you've got over the fact that they're pigs and everything else, everything that happens. Although a bit in some of the later episodes, it does get a little tiny bit fantastical, like Daddy Pig getting stuck at the top of the Eiffel Tower in one.
Yes.
There's another one where they end up on a desert island. But even that's only just a tiny bit fantastical.
Most of the episodes are Peppa goes playing in a puddle.
Yes,
she gets dirty. She gets cleaned up.
The one is the muddy puddle. Is the episode.
Absolutely.
So very classical.
Yes.
Equilibrium disruption.
Yes.
You need wellies.
Yes.
Return to
Yes.
equilibrium.
Yeah.
One
Yeah.
has wellies.
Yeah.
No, I think and even the episode titles speak a little bit to this. They are very. I think banal is, and in a great way. Muddy puddles. My dinosaur is lost. Best friend, and they're the first 3 episodes. And I think there's something. I don't know, I guess rather, kind of simplistic or accessible that is matched, or maybe the banality or the simplicity of the narratives are themselves replicated in the style. So maybe there's something around that.
Absolutely. No, I think that's really interesting. But can I just finish on the fantasy point? I think you could go to a third level and say it's actually a fantasy of banality. I'm sorry this is really kind of... But of course, it actually makes out that life is more straightforward and banal than, of course, it is really. So there's another sense of fantasy, of meaning actually everyday life isn't really that straightforward, even for children.
So it becomes a distillation of these kind of banality.
A fantasy of the banal or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, it sort of removes the messiness of life and makes it sort of ordered and routine.
And also the whole thing is always, the problems are always solved immediately. Everyone ends up laughing and is happy, which is what I adore. The end, I love the laughing.
I was going to say the laughing
is fabulous.
Yeah, most episodes end with.
But it always ends with a certain unusually almost hysterical laughter. But all of that is of course a fantasy of what everyday life is like. So it's a different uses of the word fantasy, but I mean that is itself quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think from my perspective, I think the key thing here is the sort of the anthropomorphism and the use of animals to speak to ordinary concerns, and that's such a sort of tried and tested sort of folklore storytelling that feeds into fantasy storytelling. This sits alongside all kinds of. Right back to sort of Renard the Fox, all these kind of things. But rather than having these larger than life pranksters, it's this cuddly with quotation marks around it depiction of a suburban life full of pigs and elephants and sheep. And I must
and also gazelles and it's also essentially it's not only domestic. Not only animals we have in this country, apart from in zoos.
No, yeah,
whether
absolutely.
they're meant to be, whether you're meant to think of them almost more like cuddly toys. I don't know. Like the elephant, I particularly think, is that elephant... I was about to say, is that a real elephant?
Yes.
It's not, but fantasy of an elephant. But is it there? Because it's even the same size as Peppa.
Yes.
And so is it really an idea that these are all cuddly toys, rather than that they are...
Oh, that's
animals.
very interesting.
That they're being played with in some way.
Which has a certain British tradition, right, with sort of bagpuss, the sort of, toys coming to life. I know you've written a little bit on this, haven't you, Chris, about anthropomorphism, sort of the sort of scale between mice and Mickey Mouse and things like that.
Yes, I suppose it's the sort you're playing the percentages or the ratio between the human and the non-human, and these things exist on a sliding scale of at what point do nature and culture collide, and what's the kind of hierarchy there? Are these animals that are ostensibly humans? They are animals, but they are humans in all but look. If you like.
I know. I thought it was interesting. There are two things that make them pig-like. One, of course, is the snorting.
Yes,
particularly Daddy Pig, but all of them, and of course Peppa herself snorts.
Yes,
I love there's one episode in which they all have to. I think they have to sing. And they all, and Madam, I think it's Madam Gazelle at the nursery school, teaches them how to sing. And of course, they all just sing, they all snort or bar or whatever else it is. But the other thing, of course, is jumping in mud. I mean, it really surprised me. I thought, God, don't the parents mind that they come back so much? And at one point, he does say, you're a bit dirty, and cleans off George particularly, I think. Yeah. But nonetheless, of course, that's our idea of pigs, is that they like wallowing in mud.
But I think that's interesting, because that ties in, the broader narrative. So the very, very first episode, Muddy Puddles, is about exactly that. And I think it's through that connection that we would have between pigs and mud in this episode is being transformed, because it's about they need to have Wellingtons, and this is really important for the way. But that then speaks to the way that the animals are being articulated, and that collision between the natural instinctual nature of animals and the pig in them that wants to roll around in mud, and then that is countered or tempered or qualified by the shift to you need Wellingtons and you need to be addressed appropriately. So actually, in that very first episode.
But you only need Wellingtons. You don't need anything else.
No.
Which is, I think,
it's a sort of classic cartoon when Donald Duck needs a bathroom when he gets out of the shower.
He's naked at the rest of the
have you seen the episode The Queen? Because in that, they go and visit the Queen, and then they all go jumping in the puddle, and the Queen is about to join, and they say, "Oh no, you can't, because you haven't got any Wellingtons." And so she has to go off and get Wellingtons, and then she comes back and enjoys. And then, of course, the voiceover is everyone loves jumping in puddles.
Well, this is true. So there we go. The television program is consistent in the way that it sets up these complex narrative components in episode 1 and then maintains it throughout. But no, I think that first episode, it does a lot in terms of solidifying relationships between characters, between Peppa and George, between kind of the location, of course, the house on the hill. It does a lot of world building as it does, and actually the first few episodes do exactly that. The episodes explore the space, we explore the space, and so forth. But that kind of muddy puddle. It's interesting that we're having this conversation about muddy puddles. It's lovely. Muddy puddles. That brings out some of these tensions that I think the television program plays with, i.e., what animals are allowed to be animals in this world, what animals are not. The fact that animals can have pets, animals can have animals, pigs can have parrots. As a later episode in season 1.
Yeah.
So there's a lot going on in terms of, if it's about the fantasy of banality, it seems to be about what we do when we cast animals as characters and what kind of expressive scope that opens for us as animators, for example. What can we do with character relationships that in the real world wouldn't really connect? So I think that for me, that's that and the style of the thing.
Although it almost feels like they're not. They might just the lamb or the sheep might just as well be a dog. I mean, there's nothing. Well, occasionally, like the fox in one of them, the fox in who sells a gnome for Grandpa's pond, has a kind of Cockney wide boy, which is a bit like the fox in Pinocchio of Disney. Yeah. So very occasionally there's something, but really they're almost interchangeable in terms of what animals they happen to be.
That's interesting. I wonder if there's a kind of register, or they're playing into a kind of cultural consciousness.
There's something very elephanty about the elephant, or even the fox at the school is just another. I think there's a fox there, but certainly the dog and the cat and so on. They're just another Peppa.
But as you said, the pigs do have a certain gesture towards their pigness, right?
Yes. Although it's interesting, even the Queen can join in, so it turns out that we can all be pigs.
We can all be pigs, even the Queen.
And on that bombshell, we'll see you in the next episode.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. There's sort of there's Emily Elephant, her best friend, but there's nothing. Why is she an elephant? I guess is the question.
Well, she does. The only thing is that she, in the first episode we meet her, she is able to build the bricks on top of each other using her trunk.
Yeah.
So that means it's an occasion, but I mean, it's nothing. But in terms of personality, there's no real difference.
That's interesting. The role of and this kind of compatibility between characterization and the animal itself. How are these? Because I think the tendency, certainly within animation, is to create characters that befit certain animals. A fox will always be cunning.
Yes.
And these kinds of relationships between personality and design. This is the foundation of animation going back hundreds of years. You know, the personality animation, how we believe in certain characters. But it's interesting, as you said, that there's an interchangeability with the characters. We don't assign them. The crook isn't going to be the fox, or we don't really assign them those kinds of personalities, and that opens up personality in a different way, perhaps.
I mean, even in the museum one, the fox, because that's one of the more sort of sophisticated episodes. The fox sells the gnome to I forget who it is. I think it's to Grandma Pig, and says, "Oh, it's a genuine antique." And Grandpa Pig says, "Oh, well, he would say that, wouldn't he?" Some words to that effect. But then it turns out that the museum curator, who's a rabbit, who's a Welsh rabbit. I only got the joke, actually, but I was thinking about it. The fact that I thought, why is she speaking in Welsh? Anyway, no, sorry, that's a different episode. But the museum, because it's a man, the museum curator. Anyway, he confirms that the gnome indeed is an antique. So even the wily fox turns out to have not been particularly.
So I think one of the things that seems to be coming out is that in the first few episodes you solidify the family. So these are Peppa and George, we would say, the protagonists, but even that's kind of quite loose. Their parents, and they live on a hill. In a house on a hill, very simplistic, and then it seems to be that characters kind of come and go. They add depth and dimension to the world. There is the school teacher, there are friends, there is Susie the sheep, there, and suddenly you get this accumulation of different kinds of characters that aren't consistent, but perhaps come in and out of. And the series, as it has been for the last 4 or 5 years, has been snapshots of the world of Peppa Pig and places that they go and stuff that happens to them. Alex, you're looking quizzical.
I always look quizzical, but now I'm looking quizzical. Yes. I'm just thinking about... we often sort of, I don't know, perhaps clumsily divide narratives into sort of character-based narratives and plot-based narratives. And I'm trying to think... You're using the word complexity and world-building, which I think is right, because... you get an accumulative knowledge of this land and these places.
Yeah.
But actually, I find it very, it's sparse on its characterization and it's sparse on its plotting. So what is it giving us instead is sort of the question I'm wondering. Because actually, there's not much character journey going on. I can define Peppa Pig. She's cheery. She's playful. That's about it. I find it difficult.
Boss. Some of the people that don't like it particularly think she's bossy.
Okay,
But she isn't very boss.
I don't think anyone's very anything.
Yeah, no one's. That's absolutely right. Yes.
And so it's not really, not that I'm necessarily comparing this to sort of classical narrative theory here. But if I'm not if I'm not compelled to watch because I'm trying to see the growth of the character, and I'm not compelled to watch because something exciting is going to happen, what am I compelled to watch? And I guess for me a gesture, but perhaps we can play with this a bit, is just a sense of familiarity and coziness and characters come in and out. It's like they pop round for tea, then they go. That's one episode. Next episode they go on a little jaunt to the park. It's almost like a sort of, it must almost episodically be what it feels like as a child, right? Each day you do something different, you don't quite know why, people come in and out, they're all very friendly, and this sort of fantasy of banality.
I like that. I do like that idea, and I'm wondering, and I'm not going to be that person that connects it to slow cinema. I'm not going to be that person. But there is something quite plodding and in a great way.
It's a Béla Tarr.
These are only 5 or 6 minute long episodes, really, and it's not that they cram a lot in, but there's a sort of establishing of something's going to happen. There is a sense of drama, i.e. the toy will be lost or Wellingtons will be, misplaced, and one needs, as we know, if listeners take nothing away from this episode, it's that you need Wellingtons to run around in muddy puddles. There might be a game of hide and seek, and a character goes missing and they can't find them, but then they find them again. So I know what you mean, and I wonder whether this fantasy of banality ties into this issue of it's very nice and very cozy and very
simple.
Yeah, but not in a negative way. It's not simple. I mean, I could argue that it's simple in the way that it's designed, in terms of the composition of some of the shots or the design of the characters. The use of colour is very flat. It's a very kind of flattened graphic aesthetic. There isn't an attempt to depth. It's comic book like. I think tableau framing, characters go from left to right. They very, very rarely go forward to back or these kinds of things.
Oh, there's no perspective.
No perspective.
That's the eyes.
Yeah,
particularly interesting.
That's so trademark, isn't it?
Yeah.
So the 2 eyes on the side of the head.
So what is it then? I mean, and maybe this is a question that Richard can answer. This idea of niceness. I know that you're interested in the niceness of it. It is very cosy and comfortable, as Alex would say. But
but I was interested that you said, well, it's not Béla Tarr, of course it isn't.
Yeah.
But I actually think,
or is it?
Because I was thinking, because I think there is a way in which it is. Well, it made me think about the debates that people had when people rediscovered early cinema. There was a great kind of excitement that suddenly all this stuff that we'd all thought was just a kind of archaeological interest. Suddenly people became very interested in it. And of course one thing that people ran a lot with was cinema of attractions.
Yes.
But also, which of course you could easily see this as kind of, what's the attraction of this particular episode? It's this, that maybe there's a story with, there's certainly not a developing story across the series.
Yes.
But maybe there's a sort of a story, but often it is just the dancing or something might just be all the story is. So, but then the other thing people did with the early cinema was say, well, it's avant-garde really, because it's not obeying the rules of classical cinema. This is what could have, and of course there was that kind of radical view that early cinema, it suggested that cinema could have been this really progressive avant-garde form, and then it was kind of hijacked by bourgeois classical cinema. And then the people said, well, should we really start comparing early cinema with sort of modernism and avant-garde? And I thought, well, you could talk about Peppa Pig, clearly not in terms of long takes, but in terms of simplicity, in terms of repetition. And I really thought the people one might think of are people like Giorgio Morandi or Matisse, late Matisse, or these kind of painters who paint the same thing over and over again. And the only thing is, I thought that in a way I like the earlier episodes of Peppa better because they are just that. And then I think then somehow it wants to become more sophisticated, or somebody or other wanted it to become more. Perhaps they just got bored doing it. But in a way, the boredom of the repetition, if you think of Rothko and all these, that whole direction in modern painting towards simplification, repetition, endlessly doing. And because I remember, if you see a single painting by Giorgio Morandi, you think, oh yeah, that's all right. If you see 100, which are all practically interchangeable, you think it's wonderful because it's the tiny little variations that are so sort of fascinating. And I thought Peppa Pig was that, although of course for the benefit of this podcast, of course, I watched a lot more, and I've realised there's a whole lot more that are much more complicated.
Yeah.
But what I liked about the early ones is that they are just variations on a theme.
George wants to jump into the big puddle first.
Stop, George. I must check if it's safe for you. Good. It is safe for you.
Peppa and George love jumping in muddy puddles.
Time to pause the podcast for just a moment, folks. We at fantasy-animation.org publish weekly blog posts that highlight a certain aspect of the relationship between fantasy cinema and animation by a particular writer each week, looking at their own interests.
Absolutely. We've got chances for people to publish on particular films, television programmes. We'd love to hear from you if you have a particular sequence from your favourite film or television programme that you want to talk about. If you've read a book on fantasy and animation, if you've been to an event, a conference, or even a festival. We'd love to hear from you if you've got something to say about fantasy and animation in the form of an editorial. These can be an interpretation, a reflection of an idea or concept, anything that connects up fantasy and animation together. From creative practitioners to more philosophical readings, we'd love to hear from you.
So examples of previous blog posts have included a range of items from a look at Soho cinema practice and the relationship between fantasy in animation studios working in the London area.
We've got work on particular studios, whether it's the Leica studios, whether it's the Pixar studios, whether it's the DreamWorks studios. We've got thoughts on animated documentaries.
We've got reviews of Captain Marvel, the new Dumbo movie, as well as reflections on How to Train Your Dragon and its engagement with queer theory. Any kind of angle you want to come at this from, we'd be open to hearing ideas. We don't have a deadline. We operate on a rolling submission process. All you need to do is get in contact with us on the website under the How to Contribute tab or the Contact Us tab. It's easy to find, and we're waiting to hear from you.
Well, actually, the first note I've got about the first episode is about the modernist design.
Oh, right, yes.
Because obviously that connects up with some sort of mid-50s, mid-60s shift within animation that are a rejection in some ways of Disney and certain kind of studios, United Productions of America, that are working with suggestions of characters, suggestions of physiognomy, suggestions of setting. And actually the setting, there is no depth and dimension. It's done through a kind of power of the line where lines don't quite join up. And actually looking at some of the... It is very flat, Peppa Pig, but looking at the backgrounds, they're kind of... and I'm doing inverted commas, poorly drawn, because the lines aren't perpendicular or parallel, and there is no. And I noticed the light switch by the stairs is all wonky, but we just and the lights of the lines, vanishing points, the kind of spatial organisation doesn't really read as true, which is absolutely fine, but. It reminded me of that sort of simplicity of modernist design that is working with a kind of suggestion of there's enough in the frame to get a sense of where the stairs are in relation to the lounge, and you kind of know the layout of the house, even if it's from the long shots impossible in terms of the dimensions. And so there is kind of something there in which the programme is itself, I don't know, it seems to recall these sorts of... not avant-garde in the sense of animation, but certainly the modernist designs of 50s and 60s UPA, that sort of, that geometric, angular, I don't know, kind of power of suggestion.
But the only thing is, one of the very few children's things I loved as a child, and I think it has been re-released, was this Mr. Magoo in 1001 Arabian Nights. I thought I loved that. But my memory of those is that you're very conscious of lines. Whereas I feel with this, you're very conscious of shape. I don't know if that's a really meaningful thing to say. It seems to be like blocks of colour. Of course, they do have lines round them. But somehow the line, I don't see the line, I see the block. Am I just
I think that's interesting.
Right? It's got a colouring book aesthetic. Right? I mean, knowing very little about it, but it feels like drawings that feel coloured in. And the pleasure of colouring in, right? You sort of do visually when you watch it.
And because it does occasionally, there's that nice episode about painting. Where which on the one hand has this kind of... Because I think there's a sort of clever dick element that comes in some of the episodes. But I think it's very interesting, the whole thing about Daddy Pig, first of all, that he paints an apple tree, which of course looks exactly like the apple tree in a way that all paintings don't look. I mean, you see what they're referencing, but they don't. They're not.
Yes. I guess Daddy Pig in the world of Peppa Pig is a sort of Dutch realist.
Yes. But even a Dutch realist, you see why it's like that, but you still see its paint. But of course, this is exactly the same. And then the birds come and mess it up by jumping about in it, and then they jump in the paint, and they jump on the grass, and they make the same marks. So then I think the voiceover says, and the painting looks exact. Now I wrote it down actually. It said the painting looks exact. The birds have made exactly the same pattern as the painting, or something like that. So you could see this, but I just think it's a kind of delight in these flat shapes that are, unless with the birds. The marks of the footprints, they're just sort of flat shapes, and it's just like Matisse or something. Actually,
but it actually boils down to, I suppose, obviously the child audience, and we don't need to rehearse that debate. But there's something, the way in which character design works, and the use of lines and shapes and angles, and positive characters are often rounded, and Jafar in Aladdin is very tall and angular, and there are ways in which you can instantly and economically connote certain kinds of characterization through round shapes and square spaces and all these sorts of things. And so it is doing that. I think the colouring book aesthetic is interesting. It does work very blocky. There's no kind of shading in that sense. So it is very legible. And there's something even banal in the way that it's formally designed. So there is a real nice compatibility between the banality of the narrative. So I don't think it would work if it was a kind of hyper-real... we had conversations previously about, I don't know whether these kinds of narratives, it has to be done in that sort of limited style, or that
even sort of photorealist, but it would be bad. It would feel out of kilter, wouldn't it?
There's a nice interplay between the themes and the plotting and the topics that are being dealt with, the treatment of it in this sort of repetitious way, and also the style. The style is relatively consistent across all the episodes.
And it's the style. The implication of the style is that it's, even though actually it would be child's drawings, child's paintings that you see are actually more daubed and messy, but it's almost like how a child would animate if it could animate.
Yeah, it would animate the animals the same size, because there is no difference between a pig and an elephant. They work as icons rather than...
And then talking about, I'm really interested in this fantasy of banality idea, and I think the more I'm thinking about it, the more we often think of fantasy in storytelling as embellishing or adding to reality, or intruding upon by adding some extra dimension or element or character that can do things. Here, actually, as much as if we just step aside the fact they're all animals that can talk, a lot of the fantasy is in simplification. As you're saying, it's about making things complicated simple, and removing nuances, and removing making it block-like as a metaphor, or life block-like into a series of structures. So the fantasy is actually taking away from reality rather than giving to reality in this time. I guess I'm very excited that we've now compared Peppa Pig to the heritage of high modernism. But I guess the thing,
name-checking Matisse.
I think that is problem. Obviously, on one level, I think, oh, come on, get a grip. But at the same time, there is some formal similarity. And actually, I think there is, I'm not sure in Moran, but certainly in Matisse and Clay, although Clay is a bit different, there was a kind of principle of being childlike, and particularly Clay, that's what a lot of what Clay is about. We must get back to the simplicity of the vision of childhood and so on. So it's not completely mad to make the comparison.
I guess the aesthetic is less, or at least the intent, if we can ever talk about intent, is less confrontational. It doesn't ask us to contemplate.
Yes, sure.
It doesn't ask us to enumerate.
Really in that sense, I wonder, but I don't know enough about it, about minimalism in music and that kind of valuation of repetition, which of course has also interested me recently, in the valuation of repetition in the serial killer film as a formal quality of serial killer films. Obviously, I'm not Peppa Pig as serial killer, but nonetheless, I just think there are also I was trying to think if there are other kinds of films, but if you see something like Jeanne Dielman, which is partly about the repetition of housework, but it is so slow. And so on. So it doesn't quite... I just don't know that there might be avant-garde films that are just about repetition.
Yeah.
But I certainly think in music there's that whole development of Steve Reich and all these people. I don't know much about it actually.
Is this repetitious though, or is this simplistic, for want of a better term? I don't find Peppa Pig repetitious. In a way I do, because it's 7 minutes an episode. It's not like they do anything drastically different. But of course they're not doing the same thing.
No, well, of course, yes, but of course that's true, and that's in a way you can see why it had to develop the way it did, and it becomes much more complex and self-reflexive, and they go to Paris and all this sort of thing. But I really liked the early episodes, which seemed to be. Obviously they're not pure repetition because there's no such thing really, but because. Even if one episode was exactly like another, which would be, of course, pure avant-gardism, the second one would be different by virtue of being the second one, just by virtue of not being, there's no such thing as pure repetition. But it is repetitious, partly just that whole thing about the beginning. It goes, every time, I'm Peppa Pig and this is George and all the rest of it.
Yes.
But also, the first episodes, so little happens that it feels like it's just a little variation. It is like, I was talking about Mirandia, it's just, he's moved the plot a bit to one side and so on. But then they become more developed in a way. And I suppose, I wonder if it's partly the animators, but I wonder if also there's a feeling we need to put something in for the parents, because the parents are going to sit there bored out of their heads if we just keep repeating it over and over.
One of the notes I have actually is about the role of adults, I suppose, in the programme itself, and the role of parental the parents and then the grandparents, and often they're part of the games. In some of the earlier episodes, the hide and seek episode where George hides on the dad's lap behind the newspaper, and there's there's that. The role of adults and parental figures and the teachers and these kinds of things. How the distinction between adults and children is slightly blurred. Obviously, in the real world, we have the kind of portmanteau terms of man, child, and kidult, and all this sorts of things. So I like the early episodes because the children do engage with the adults. Perhaps the adults are not figures of authority per se, but they're part. And actually, a lot of the episodes end with them, as you say, rolling around laughing. And there's a real sort of democracy at the end where they're all part of the. It's
and
all
they're all in the mud.
They're all in the mud with Wellingtons. But there's something, very. Formally, I like the idea that formally it's repetition. Obviously, the style is repetitious. The opening title. This is how seriality, seriality on television works through these processes of recognition between episodes, and you're catching up the new episode and stuff.
Although it's interesting, but it of course isn't. There's no catching up.
No,
there's never any need to catch up.
Previously,
you can watch anything. There's never previously.
Yeah, I missed season 1 of Peppa Pig. I must confess in prep for this, but I feel like I've caught up.
Yes,
do you know what I mean? That's interesting, and this simplicity being. I guess I wonder if we could make strange or problematise this idea of simplicity being appealing for children but mind-numbing or boring for adults, and sort of pick that. Must do this at one point because, like Chris, I was inundated with family requests as soon as they heard I was doing Peppa Pig. and Emily, if you're listening, she's written a nice review for us. The reason I like Peppa Pig is it teaches you things like maths. Georgia and Peppa are very funny, and they make me laugh. I like to watch Peppa Pig when I am sad or poorly, as it makes me feel comfortable and safe. And my favourite characters are Peppa Pig, Susie Sheep, and Emily Elephant. And I can attest that Emily is a big Peppa Pig fan and has been to Peppa Pig World down in Polton's Park in the South Coast, and watches these things on repeat over and over again, as my cousin attests.
Which is important about the whole thing about repetition, that it almost doesn't. You could just have one episode and just have it repeated all the time.
Absolutely. So we've got double repetition. Right? We've got the episodes themselves are repetitious, and then the act of watching it, certainly for their target audience, is repetitious. So. And there's something comforting about that. That's clearly coming out here. Is it child concerns over an adult? And the psychoanalysis is coming out in me again, the classic Freudian. But the sort of adult world, the unknown is scary, so stay within the known, repeat the known, and things like that. But of course, there's certain problems with that when you're an adult, when you know the horizon is more. Deeper, broader than things. I don't know. This idea that children like simple things, adult like complex things, is always worth pausing and critiquing a little bit.
Well, yes, I know.
Because I think there's a lot of,
in one sense, although of course it is I understand, is very popular with children, but of course it is made by adults.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's sort of partly it's an adult idea of what it is like to be a child. And of course, none of us can ever really recover what the experience of being a child is. And I mean, I think my idea of what it was like is that it's much more inchoate, that this is much more disciplined and controlled, and that might be what's nice about it, than the world, which is all these things happening and you can't control them and so on.
Absolutely.
So it's more like what is comforting in childhood rather than this is what childhood is like.
But there's also a sort of social dilemma that I always think when I think about children's media and children's audiences, that Ewan Kirkland writes a lot on this, I remember him saying something at a conference once that's always stuck with me, which is that childhood is the only social category that we rarely, or at least one of the last social categories we rarely problematise as being a social category, right? There's a certain biological reality to it. But again, what an 8-year-old likes is just as meaningless as what a man likes and what a woman likes and all this kind of stuff, right? So actually, when we talk about a child, we're really talking about a social category that, as adults, we have created and often speak more to our anxieties and concerns. You know, it's historic, it's socially coded. So I think there's some interesting things here about even watching it now as an adult, thinking what a child would think when you're watching it. That's part of the dynamic of the show, right? Is that you can't help do this. And that's interesting, right? I guess in a way it can be compared with something like a woman's cinema or something like that, or the chick flick or whatever it is. These categories of media that are so the target audience is so rammed down your throat. It's hard to just watch them as a human being, right? You know, I don't know. I've said a lot there, and I don't really have anything to follow up on that.
But of course, it's with the two thing. One is, of course, with even though most like classic women's pictures were directed by men, but they were mainly based upon fiction written by women, and and the women stars had a big. So there was a kind of input of women as well as the address to women. Whereas, of course, there may be some input of children at some level, but it's a Peppa Pig, but not really. But the other thing is how much I think as it goes on, how it puts in these things which you feel are really for the best. Even like the Welsh rabbit, it was something that's a little joke an adult can pick up on and feel. And there's one that in the painting one when Daddy Pig goes outside. I used to paint, and comes back and he has a beret on, and then there's a little discussion about that. No, you have to wear a beret, and now that of course is itself already, on the whole, adults will know the cliche of the French painter with the beret. But what's not remarked upon is that his moustache has changed. That he has this sort of brushy, rather piggy moustache. Initially, just a few little lines. But when he comes back, suddenly it's all curlicued in a way of a sort of French cliche. And presumably that's there for the parents to at some point notice. But then that, I think, goes back to what you just said, that those things being put in, as it were, I suspect have the function of confirming what is childlike, as opposed to this is what we adults think, but this is what as if they know what is childlike.
Yes, and I'm suspicious of the potential hierarchy of that, right? Which is I'll get this joke about the Welsh rarebit, but my child won't.
Yes,
that's
exactly.
not for them. So and it also confirms my position as adult.
Absolutely,
right? Because I'm getting the jokes and you're.
And in a way, it makes tolerable the fun made of adults, particularly. I mean, again, on the internet, there's a lot of upset about that. Almost like the Daddy Pig is harassed and mocked, and there's a whole thing about fat shaming in the episode in the treehouse.
You have to say the secret words, then you can come into our house.
I see. And what are the secret words?
I have to whisper them to you. The secret words are Daddy's big tummy.
I see.
Say the secret words.
Daddy's big tummy.
That's right. Daddy's big tummy.
I think those are silly secret words.
They all get into the Peppa's treehouse, which has been built by Grandpa Pig, and the code word. She said you can only come into the treehouse if you say the magic words, and the magic words are Daddy's big tummy. So first of all, and Daddy doesn't want to say Daddy's big tummy. But he nonetheless, this is what some of the comments on the internet, he is humiliated in having to say Daddy's big tummy, and what's more, he can't get into the treehouse because of his big tummy. The only way he can get in is if they take the roof off, and of course, and that's typical. That on the one hand, in a way, it's quite sort of teasing and negative towards parents, but then parents have got the comfort of, well, yes, but we are superior nonetheless because we get the joke about Welsh Rabbit and so on. And also the other thing about that episode, which gets onto sort of the niceness, is it is solved immediately. So I think that's part of the niceness, is that things are always, there's never a problem for very long, and then everyone laughs, so it's all right.
And Daddy Pig doesn't really mind.
And he doesn't really mind, yes.
Yeah. I'm interested in when we say that the later episodes become more complex.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if we think of the audience as pursuing the series through its various iterations, whether through this process, if we're saying that the animation, or this instance of this animated television program, working through a kind of discourse of kind of socialization that children are learning about the world, and so the first few episodes are very simplistic: what it means to have a relative, what it means to have parents, how to play in puddles, what happens when you lose a toy, what happens when you invite your best friend round, when you have a pet, all these kinds of things. And then it becomes more, quote unquote, more complex. And I'm wondering, is the assumption that the audience is watching these episodes, and as they learn more about the world of Peppa Pig gets more kind of convoluted and intricate, and the animators pull things in to kind of quantify and I guess raise and nuance that world in a particular kind of way? Is it something? Does the world develop in a way that the audience themselves can actually, if you watch it sequentially, you can see that the world gets bigger and bigger, and as they're getting older, as the child audience is getting older, the world's getting more kind of complex. I don't know.
I feel it's an eternal present, really. I mean, yes, it does. It's true that they do go to Paris and a desert island and all sorts of other things like that. But and suddenly you discover there's a museum nearby and so on. But I feel I just think it's almost like the animators couldn't bear just to keep making the same thing. So that for them, and also maybe there was a feeling, these poor parents, let's make so the episodes will be more interesting if we put in all these little jokey things about.
So it's the humour that when we talk about complex, it's humour. It's a shift towards a kind of reflexivity.
Yes. There's an element of that.
It's an expansion of the world. One of the criticisms, or I suppose one of the pleasures of a programme like The Simpsons, is that the world of Springfield is entirely incoherent. And this has started to become a feature of the programme, where they self-reflexively or self-consciously acknowledge the fact that there's like a bowling alley next to this, when clearly that's not true. So they like the fact that the space itself is kind of fluid and malleable, and it allows them to create this sort of geographical imaginary of what Springfield actually like. It seems like with here, they have a house on the hill, and then there are other bits that get added to.
You can go away, or you can, and the voiceover. There's the one about getting in Desert Island. It starts with they are visiting Captain Dog, I think he is, and so it's so we are immediately told that. Of course, the thing about the book, we should talk about the voiceover. It's very interesting, I think. But so I don't think there's in that sense any particular development, but there is a kind of there is a, and it never pushes it too far. It just there might be a little bit of self-reflexivity, but nothing that's going to undermine or make incoherent this world, which is always. It's a stable world.
I think that's right. I think in terms of this is why I like the first few episodes of anything, in terms of like a cross-section of episodes to look at. What does it do? It solidifies certain kinds of rules and things that perhaps can or can't happen. When a toy gets lost in a tree, we know that gravity is, and these kinds of things, little nuances. When the characters are playing hide and seek, they are discovering and hiding in different parts of the rooms that we've never seen before, and so there's something. I think you're right. It's a very stable. But you might get there's in the episode where they dig up, where they're making a pond, and they get the bull to come. Mr. Bull comes with his digger and helps to dig the pond. That's to help the museum keeper, in fact. And at that point, the voiceover says, Mr. Bull is really, I think it's Mr. Bull is really good at this, expert at digging. And the voiceover shouts. So it's like a little joke about the the noise of the digging means that the voiceover actually has to shout. But it's a little bit there, and it's nice for adults, and they can feel superior. But it doesn't
in any way disrupt the fabric of the.
No, I think the voiceover is interesting in terms of that repetition and cycles of repetition. I think the voice work we would associate, and this is true of a lot of television animation, that child characters are voiced by adults because they can. There are many reasons why this might be the case, whether it's to do with labour and labour laws and these and obviously the role of the child as they mature and their inability to play young. And so this is very typical in some respects, that if you look down the cast, you have lots of kind of adults performing as children, which is not necessarily the case in other kinds of animated film and largely film actually. But kind of the use of accents, because there are all these sorts of things the voices, becomes very interesting, but then it's that tension between nature and culture. These are characters that can talk quite eloquently, but then snort. And actually, in the soundtrack, through that shift between kind of a cultured response to something, and then just perhaps an instinctual snort because something is funny. It reminds you that they're pigs, and I do really like that. That might be a moment. The sound might be the moment where we realise if the characters are interchangeable, that the program downplays pigness, elephantness, parrotness. It's actually in the sound or the soundtrack that it announces there.
Thinking about the animation style as well, so I'm sort of been enumerating on something you said, Richard, about sort of this idea, which I sort of definitely agree with, that the television show needs to expand because there's this sense of this frustrated animator constantly clicking on the same pig moving up and down the house. But of course, and this is probably time for my impossible question, Chris. Every week on the podcast, I usually ask Chris a question that's absolutely impossible to answer.
We haven't rehearsed.
He has no way prepped for. But there's interesting. The animation looks simple, but of course, from my understanding, this is all done on a computer. The way it's constructed must require a lot of sophisticated programming, and I wonder whether this idea that this animator is sitting there filling in paints, with the thing, is actually a bit of an illusion. And actually, maybe it's harder, or at least as labour intensive, to animate something like Peppa Pig as it is to do these great big film DreamWorks photorealist things. So, and to sort of bring back to what you were saying there, Chris, there's a paradox also, I think, in the animation style, in that it looks like it's just been drawn quickly on a flipbook, but of course it's so smooth and glossy and things like that. And there's as the pig is both civilised and snort, the animation is both simple and sophisticated at the same time. So that's enough time. Answer my impossible question.
My feeling would be exactly the opposite, and I wonder whether it's simple. When you get the bank or the archive of characters and settings, then what you're really doing is playing with those components and those constituent parts. And I wonder whether the sheer volume of episodes speaks to something that is done on computer and perhaps toon shaded or cell shaded. So this idea that the computer doesn't look like anything, but what it can look like is everything. It can look like and replicate faithfully the kind of drawn element to it. It looks very painterly. It looks like kind of Windows 95, Windows 98 paint kind of thing, but there's a charm in that, of course. I wonder whether when you have this bank, when animators have created this archive of characters, and I'd be interested to see how much repetition there actually is industrially in terms of that is a repeating shot from this, and actually where later episodes are kind of quite Frankensteinian because they're pulling that establishing shot of the house on the hill, and they're pulling that shot of Peppa going up the stairs or whatever it might be. That I wonder whether industrially or at the level of the animation, these are repeating shots, and actually that makes them that feeds into that. I would say the ease. My feeling is that there's an ease, that it gets easier insofar as when you have that archive of characters and settings and places that you can go, then you can start to play with different elements, and you don't have to reanimate Peppa every time. You have Peppa on a computer that you can pull from the archives and place into a series of scenarios. They become performers, they become animated stars, or they become animated performers because you can put them into various settings. I don't know whether that's true. I'd have to do a bit more research in terms of the style and the kind of. It's certainly very graphic, as I said before, very very flattened. It has that kind of quality of flash animation, like web animation, in terms of its shapes and its as you said, the boldness of colour. But no, I'd have to do a bit more in research into how it is created and whether there's a repetition going on.
I've never had a sense of that I'm seeing the same shot.
Yeah, I'd be interested.
But I haven't.
But that's interesting then. That if it's not built, there are so many different episodes that they've managed to.
Maybe it is. I mean,
Yeah.
But also, I was interested about DreamWorks because I realised one of the things I don't like about a lot of CGI is it's so busy. I feel exhausted after about 2 minutes. And I feel this is restful in a way.
That's interesting. Well, actually, we would think of that's really interesting in terms of my research into digital computer animated films. Insofar as we would associate the digital with kind of addition. It adds to the shots. It removes wires, of course, but it fills the world. Whether it's blue screen or green screen, whether it's programs that create crowd systems that kind of copy and paste, and you have these vast, whether it's historical epics, Troy, Kingdom of Heaven, Alexander, these sorts of early Gladiator, these sorts of early 2000 films that very much about multitudes, adding. And Kristen Bissell's written a book on digital effects that has a section in it or a chapter in it on the digital multitude. And I don't think there's any coincidence that a lot of early computer animated films are about ants and rats and bees and penguins and kind of these big crowds that fill the frame. You're absolutely right. Here there's a pleasure in the opposite, where the digital is stripping, everything's stripped back.
So the house is on the hill on its own, and there's it's not next to lots of other houses, and yet they seem to be able to get to everywhere else very quickly and all this sort of stuff.
No, I think that's right. There's something about the use of the application of the technology in this sense that we would certainly associate computer animated films as busy. These are busy worlds. There's a lot going on, and that speaks to the animation in the broadest sense. That these are worlds that are perpetually on assignment. They have agency. If you look in the background, you can. Whereas this is a program that doesn't have that sort of. There's not something else that diverts your eye in the background. There isn't a sort of playing with depth and dimension. Everything the things that you're meant to see are the things that are moving. And that's it.
That's interesting. Very interesting. So, with the sense of time and wrapping up, we've
I just want to speak about the voice. Could be a voiceover.
Oh, sure, yes.
Say something about it.
We've got plenty of time. I'm sure listeners do too.
It's just that I thought it's interesting that Peppa introduces it.
Yes. And
she also names each episode. But after that, the voiceover is a man. So I think, first of all, it's not Peppa. But secondly, it's a man. A rather soft voice. It makes me think of Magic Roundabout type voice. And I was thinking also that in a way, the link of that with, that in a way it's Daddy Pig, although he's made fun of, he is also the one, it's this classic thing, what people say about male and female parents, that fathers have the quality time and the women sort of say, but you should know, you must put your Wellingtons on or whatever, I'm not sure, that's certainly what some of the people that don't like the programme say, that it's, and it is quite traditional gender roles in a certain way. But the other thing that I think fascinates me about the voiceover is that it's how unnecessary it is. It's constantly telling you things that you can see.
So what's the function? Is it something to do with this? And we've talked previously on podcasts about kind of traditions of storytelling and the bedtime. And there are lots of television programmes, I think, aimed at children that are on specific channels that are geared towards, okay, now we're in bedtime mode. And storytelling becomes really important, not just the act of, or the story itself, but the fact that you're being told something. And we have these channels where stars come in and read stories to children as they fall asleep. And so here, I wonder then what the function of it is. Is it to restate the visuals? No. What it is perhaps to do, it's part of that welcoming. You're being told something.
Well, I think it is partly that. Although I wonder, again, it goes back to what people said about early cinema, that people found, I don't know if this is what was claimed, people couldn't follow early films, so they needed often a voiceover, which of course continued in Japan very long, but even in other traditions, saying, like, if you see something like the Life of an American Cowboy, it's true, you think, what is going on? And so you need a voice to kind of help you through it. And this, I mean, at the same time, I find it very hard to believe, but like I said, Peppa and George really love jumping up and down in muddy puddles. We think, well, I can see that. Do I really?
Who doesn't?
Really need to be told? I mean, I wrote down a lot of them actually. Peppa is thinking of something to say to Polly. This is with the parrot. Well, you can see that she is, and maybe you're right. It is to do with that tradition, but also, I don't know. There's something. I know that I can't remember what her argument was. In Susan Sontag, in writing about Diary of a Country Priest, talks about the fact that you see him writing, but you also hear him saying what you see him writing. And what he's saying and what he's writing is something you know has already happened. So there's something about that kind of redundancy. And I think maybe she's making a modernist argument about repetition and redundancy is itself a kind of almost an aesthetic quality. I don't know. It just amazed me how much the voiceover was not needed. But it does also, first of all, it secures it back in the adult's in control of the story.
Yes.
And also it does suggest a link with the father. And many people see the father, and many people say really Daddy Pig is really the main character, is what some of the people who write about it on.
As is true, so many children's stories actually. You know, sort of right. You know, we've done Mary Poppins on the show, but that's all arguing a similar thing. There's a book I know by a scholar called James Whitlark. He talks about illustrations in fantasy novels, and arguing something very similar, that often illustrations are completely redundant because they go again. They're often next to the bit of the illustrated versions of Lord of the Rings are often at the most descriptive points in the story. So there's why have it when the words are there? And his argument, which I think is reasonably compelling, is that there's sort of two. There's the pleasure and the imagination you can have with words, which is actually a play with language and linguistics and sort of symbols and meaning making. Pepper and George really love playing with. There's some pleasure in the sort of the way that's being phrased, the enthusiasm of what's being said, cut with the sort of sensorial pleasures of the imagination. Look at the colours, look at the things, and it's like it's bombarding you with both of them to make it as cuddly and simple again as possible.
Right,
so I don't know. There's probably it chimed a lot with what you were saying there about this idea that the voiceover doesn't need to be there, but there's also a pleasure in him saying these lovely, they love, and then the detonation even is really kind of comforting, isn't it?
But also maybe it's a credit to the animators, and the credit to the animation that it's able to communicate, as you say, certain kinds of idea and actually get a sense of narrative through the way that the characters are looking and moving, and there's a lot. I think it's very sparse and very banal in terms, and it's a lot of writing on the program talks about kind of the triviality of it, which is the pleasure in the normal of it, and the spectacular that can be found in the normal, spectacular moderated by the normal. The drama is that the toy is stuck in the tree. Well, there it is, done, solved. So there's something there, but I don't know. It's very economical. If there is the suggestion of space and characterization and actually emotion, the performance of these characters, it's done very economically because it's not drawing on nuances of facial sort of tics and inflections in muscles. It's done through a kind of the visual style that is very sparse and very simplistic and bold and colourful and shapely. But I like the idea that the voiceover kind of complements that, but is also potentially not needed.
Yes,
in terms of pure narrative sort of economics.
It is pure narrative. There you go. Peppa Pig is Matisse meets Sontag meets pure narrative. Lovely.
It's Béla Tarr.
Béla Tarr,
Classic. So the wrap-up question I was going to ask, Richard, was because I know this idea of niceness is a sort of very elusive but very interesting concept, and I just wondered if we could sort of deal with it a bit directly before we. So we've sort of defined it, but without defining it. It's simple, whatever that word means. It's normal, whatever that word means. It's repetitious. It's
the fantasy of the banal.
It's banal. Could you talk a little bit about what niceness is as a category in the way you're thinking through it, and then perhaps is Peppa Pig nice? Would be a sort of. Is it my turn to ask another impossible question?
That's two.
Two in at one podcast. I must stop myself.
Well, I suppose I've often thought I'd quite like to write about niceness generally, but I feel too tired these days. The idea of to write a big project on some new concept. Well, it's not a new concept, but a newly. I really like trying to investigate, as it were, ordinary concepts like entertainment or something. So niceness, but in Peppa Pig, I suppose what made me think about it being niceness is the kind of the security that everything will be all right, and the security is also in the simplicity of the stories, is in the fact that there's not really any development. Yes, there's variation, but it doesn't. In the end, you're back in the same house, and everything will always be all right. And also, I was thinking about the security, and there might be a whole other thing to talk about there, but that you can tease Daddy, and it won't be a problem. There's a very nice the one in which he loses his glasses, which has, of course, a point of view shot in it of what the television looks like to Daddy Pig without his glasses, which is. But yes, and at the end, that Mummy Pig says, "Oh well, at least then you got your glasses. At least you're not grumpy anymore." And he says, "I wasn't grumpy," in a rather grumpy way. And then everyone starts laughing, and he starts laughing. So even when Daddy Pig is being a bit grumpy, or when Captain Dog is caught out saying, I'm never going to go to sea again, then immediately wants to go to sea with his friends, and he's caught out. And he, you can get a rise out of Daddy, and it's not dangerous. So all of that, but everything. So and life is the niceness is that the security of the way the world is, and that all problems can be solved, as you said earlier, quickly, and also through laughter, because I think that's what's interesting. I mean, it's giggling as well. So at the beginning, when Daddy Pig snorts in what you see every episode, the opening, they giggle. They don't really laugh. Whereas at the end of the episode, they really all laugh. They all laugh, and they often fall on their backs laughing. And so does even the Queen. I think the Queen does in the episode with the Queen, but everybody does. And I love the fact that Polly Parrot goes sideways on her, the things she's had to what do you call that? Anyway, the parrot stand, whatever.
Perch.
Perch. On her perch, she goes and she also laughs. So, and that, I feel, and I think it's very interesting about laughter, because in a way one thinks all sorts of theories of laughter are theories about how it's a release of hysteria, it's a release of tension, and I think a lot of those things are absolutely true. Laughter is also often very cruel, so one thinks about the cruelty of laughter. But what's interesting about this is the laughter of fellowship, of everything is all right. And it's interesting that it's a wordless thing. It's not about a word saying, everything's all right, you're fine. It's a sort of shared feeling of well-being that will always come to the rescue. It's always there, no matter how much Daddy is grumpy or whatever it is. And I think that's the kind of that ending on that affect of the pleasure of laughter as a solution to the problems of life. That is a kind of what is so nice about it.
So niceness is sort of defined by its ability to solve problems. I like this idea of it. It doesn't have to make sense as long as everyone's laughing.
Yes,
yeah.
And it's a laughter amongst family. And I think that's the other addition to it. That it's about kind of collective, as you say, a harmony between
anyone,
family
and friends.
Yes.
But yes, the family is at the centre of it.
Yeah.
And of course, of course, we haven't talked about it's true. It is very normative, and that's of course another part of the comfort of it. But it is also kind of, as I was thinking about, because it is very white. Now, of course, they're pink, but I mean, white people are pink. Now, it's true that it's very, in the school, it's all full of all sorts of colours. We can have all sorts of colours, but we centre white people. The centre is a white family, and it's a white family with actually pretty conventional. It's true that Mummy Pig works at home and so on, but it is conventional in a kind of modern way, conventional roles.
I've never thought about that. The invisibility of whiteness, which is often what you've written about its connections in some ways, and an analogy that you've used to discuss. I think it's heterosexuality. This idea that it's like air, that you breathe it in all the time, and you're not really. There's really something really interesting, I think, about an invisibility of whiteness that is both invisible because these are animals, but there is something still very, as you say, white about a family that is a set of pigs, pink pigs. And so there is something really interesting about, again, maybe that speaks to broader questions about when we talk about race in animation, we aren't talking about animation's ability to kind of come between us and the world and represent minorities, represent kind of black identity. It does those things, and many filmmakers, Bakshi, whatever it might be, have drawn black identity, and it's reminding, very famously the recent cartoon of Serena Williams, when Serena Williams lost in one of the finals of, I think it was the US Open, and there was a political cartoon that had done the rounds, and it was about and one of the questions was, how can we draw Serena Williams, black tennis player, aren't all images like that racist? How do we draw a black? And so there's something quite interesting about animation's ability to do race. It doesn't actually have to be like that. It plays into discourses of anthropomorphic, like racialized anthropomorphism, which comes up a lot in writing. As a book called Animating Difference, which is about how different species and speciesism is used to connote things from homosexuality to non-whiteness. So there's some interesting stuff around the use of animals is not just as surrogate humans, but certain kinds of surrogate humans. And I think I like the idea of the invisibility of whiteness through Peppa Pig.
and I would the invisibility of niceness as well. I'm going to take from this, because I think it's very easy to go, okay, it's a nice show, and it's nice because it's simple. And both of these words, simple implies sort of organic, and it implies pure, and all these words that are very sort of charged and problematic. So yeah, it perhaps might be time to problematise niceness a little bit more.
Yeah.
But it's hard to because it's so nice to watch. So that's the paradox, isn't it? It's hard to sort of get that criticality.
Yeah,
but we definitely did it a bit here, I think.
Lovely to spend time talking about Peppa Pig.
Indeed.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Richard, for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And yes, thank you to Alex for being my friend down on the pigsty.
You can find us on Twitter at FanAnim Research, FANANIM Research. You can find us on Facebook.
Yep, you can find us on Facebook by searching Fantasy Animation Research Network, and you can obviously visit the website www.fantasy-animation.org. We'll see you next time for something else. We don't know what yet, but we look forward to it. Thanks, Richard, and thanks to the listeners. Bye.
The wheels on the bus go round and round all through the town.